I remember when the humans defeated the Kress Imperium. I'll remember it until I breathe my last. Do you remember it, my old friend? There was no answer from the bed next to me. I'm sure you do. You were there after all. The war had started when I was only one cycle old. I remember when our race first discovered yours. We had stumbled on a colony during a standard mapping expedition. Rather than try to make contact at that time, our Grand Imperator sent a full honor fleet and our prime delegate. To this day, no one truly knows what went wrong or who fired first. What we do know for sure was that a lucky, or rather, unlucky shot had hit the prime delegate's flagship, killing him and the fleet commander instantly. It didn't help that the prime delegate was also the Imperator's firstborn. Shortly after that, the entire colony's defensive fleet was in ruins. In a fit of rage, the fleet subcommander had the entire colony burned to ashes, and just like that, we were at war. How you humans managed to resist us so long was almost as maddening as how you won the war. Your ships were slow, their shield were weak, and their weapons were underpowered. The only thing you had going for you was your cunning and your ability to reproduce. No matter how many colonies we burned, no matter how many ships we destroyed, there seemed to be an endless amount of reinforcements for you to send in their place. Your capacity to build fleets was like nothing we had seen before. You also fought every battle with a stubborn determination that has never been matched by over 100 races we have encountered in this galaxy. You would send 15 of your ships to destroy one of ours, and when that didn't work, you would send 50. But in the end, even that was not enough. After nearly a cycle of war, we finally saw a change. You were less likely to engage us in direct battles, preferring raids and hit-and-run tactics. When you did choose to fight us, your fleets were smaller and seemed to be less willing to commit to a full-on attack. The War Council had thought that you had finally reached the point where you were no longer capable of resisting. How wrong they were. I was a signals sub-officer, just out of primary training and barely 2 cycles or roughly 40 of your Earth years old. I was working in the War Council's tactical center. They were discussing their next steps in the war and trying in vain to determine where your homeworld might be. Suddenly, our long-range sensors picked up a group of ships jumping into real space just outside our defensive grid. We knew they were human, but didn't recognize the ship configuration. There were only 12 of them, and as they slowly made their way forward, we didn't even think to open fire. The ships were small and looked as if they had been cobbled together out of debris and wreckage. It almost seemed as if they were lost and wanted to surrender to us until they opened fire. Their weapons were pathetically weak, but they took us by surprise. Before our defensive weapons could return fire, they had done heavy damage to our main long-range sensors. Of course, they didn't get off a second shot. All but one of the ships were instantly vaporized. The last one tried to flee, but its engines overheated and melted the aft half of the ship. Instantly, the Council ordered our learners to get to work. That was the one thing we picked up from you during the war. The limited number of victories you had given you the chance to study us and our technology. You took our weapons and attempted to reverse engineer them. The result was something between your weapons and ours, but it was certainly more effective. You also studied how we fought and adapted to us as much as you could. Our ways have always been rigid. You once said that we lacked imagination, but now we tried to use your own methods against you. We studied the wreckage of your fleet, but couldn't find much use. The ships were actually cobbled together out of mismatching parts, and there were no survivors to interrogate. At the end of our learner's report, just an addendum really, was that the sole surviving ship had 2 designations. Your ship names were rather much more colorful than ours, those that were intact enough for us to study at least. The one surviving ship was named the Folly, but right under it, stenciled on the buckled hull of the bow, was 112. We thought that it was simply a numerical designation of that ship in the group and ignored it. 2 rotations later, you attacked again. This time the fleet was larger and the ships were better equipped. The fleet didn't hesitate to open fire and were much more prepared for our defenses. The battle still didn't last very long, and our losses were minimal. Once again, our learners were sent out. The few ships that were left mostly intact had a wide range of names, but every one of them had the designation 212 on their bow. Still, the Council could not understand the meaning of the designation. Had we figured it out sooner, I really doubt it would have made a difference in the end. Another 2 cycles later, almost to the minute, another fleet attacked. This one actually had ships we were familiar with. They were older battlecruisers like the Formidable, the Valiant, the Daring. This fleet was about half the size of the fleets you had sent into battle back at the beginning of the war, but they had been outfitted with more advanced weapons and shields. Our defense fleet was small since we had thought that you didn't know where our home world was and that you were on the verge of losing the war. The battle was fierce, but as was common, we gained the upper hand. When it was clear that your fleet was going to lose, the surviving ships did something we had never seen before. Rather than fleeing or fighting to the death, the last ships intentionally rammed the nearest Kressian ship. When the battle was over, your entire fleet, some 70 ships, were gone. We had lost 3 warships, and over a dozen were critically damaged. It was one of the costliest battles we had ever fought. As our repair crews were sent out to assess the damage, our learners noted on the record that every ship in the fleet that we could get a clear view on had the designation 312 on their bow. Finally, the council realized what that meant. They thought that surely the humans didn't have the ability to field 9 more fleets like the one they had just sent, but, at their suggestion, the Imperator recalled a reserve fleet and sent out several attack groups to search our home sector for more humans. Like clockwork, you would send a fleet to attack us every 2 cycles. Each fleet was larger and stronger than the last, and the names became more hostile to match the growing ferocity of your attacks. We witnessed the destruction of ships like the Vengeance and the Retaliation, and as each fleet was down to its last ships, they would ram into our or intentionally detonate their phase drives in order to cause as much damage as possible. Our losses, we mounting in fear, had begun to build not only among the rank and file, but also within the War Council itself. By the time the 812 fleet had attacked, we were recalling every active fleet within range to bolster our defenses. When Fleet 912 attacked, we were on the verge of panic. This fleet was massive, easily numbering 1,000 ships. We saw ships that we had never encountered before. These were not the crude and bulky vessels we were accustomed to. These ships were sleek and fast. Their shields were powerful, and we were quite dismayed to see that they had the same pulse cannons that our own cruisers and battleships used. By then, our entire fleet was clustered around our homeworld, so we still won the battle. But not before several of your ships broke through our lines and began to bombard our planet. The damage was relatively minor, but it set off a panic among the populace. The people knew that we were fighting off attack after attack, but the War Council had always told them that we were suffering no losses while they were being utterly destroyed. Now everyone knew that the humans were not giving up on the war, but were willing to sacrifice much to destroy us. At that point, the Council had, quietly, begun to discuss other options. As a race steeped in traditions and honor, it was almost incomprehensible to even consider surrendering to the humans. But the loss of civilian life and the fact that each fleet we faced was becoming more and more powerful was giving us cause to talk. We knew that there were at least 3 more fleets ready to attack us, and if they continued to grow in size and strength, we might not be able to win. And we knew that losing would mean the death of countless Kressians. After all the death and destruction we had visited upon your people, we knew that our fate would be sealed if we could not end the war on terms. Right on time, 2 rotations later, Fleet 1012 jumped into our system. There were only 4 ships, but they were big. No, big doesn't quite describe them. They were massive, bigger than massive. The best measurement we could get was over 5 krents, or nearly 3 of your kilometers long, almost 4 times the size of our largest war cruiser. Every open space of these ships was studded with large pulse cannons and missile tubes. They came screaming right into the heart of our fleet. For once we knew how you must have felt. We sent hundreds of ships out to fight 4 of yours, and we were getting slaughtered. But this time it was our numbers that won out. The sacrifices of so many of our ships and commanders allowed us to destroy the war, famine, pestilence, and death. As always, we didn't understand the significance of the names at the time. When it was over, we had less than 1,000 ships remaining. The inner orbit of our planet was choked with wrecked hulls and frozen bodies. Pieces of ships were raining down into our atmosphere, where they would catch fire and slam into the ground. The Council had no choice. They told the Imperator that if we didn't surrender to the humans when the next fleet arrived, then it was likely that the last vestiges of our fleet would be destroyed and that our home world would be sterilized of all life. Reluctantly, he agreed. 2 rotations later, Fleet 11, 12 jumped into our system. We couldn't get a clear reading on them, as they were outside our normal scanning range, and our long-range scanner was still damaged. It was impossible to get a clear count, but we estimated that there were almost 10,000 ships. One of them was even bigger than the last 4. It must have been at least 6 kilometers long and had what looked to be cannon that were over 1/4 kilometer in size. The fleet stayed just out of visual range, but its presence was all we needed. Almost immediately, I was ordered to send a message to your fleet. We requested that delegates be sent to discuss terms of surrender. I can't imagine the debate that went on amongst your people, but finally a small shuttle emerged from the fleet and headed towards the Imperator's palace. The War Council, in their shame, refused to meet with your delegates. Instead, they nominated one of their members and sent me along as an honor guard. That was when I saw you, my first human. You were standing at the end of your shuttle's ramp next to another delegate. You with your red folder and he with his green folder. Through the few human survivors we had managed to take, we managed to decipher your language and program a translator. Through that, the lone council member announced that he was here to discuss the terms of our surrender. You and your co-delegate traded a brief look. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I have come to learn it was relief. Your co-delegate stepped forward and offered your list of terms of our surrender. Your terms were quite reasonable, really. There were demands that we turn over copies of all military and civilian technology, as well as working prototypes, so that you could adapt them. We also had to make territorial concessions as well as accept an occupying force in order to ensure that we did not rebuild in an attempt to fight again. When all the songs were sung and our honor pledges were finished, you opened a communicator and said one word, sunrise, and you and your partner turned to leave. A voice in the transmitter in my ear told me that your fleet was beginning to approach. Maybe it was because I was young and impulsive, or perhaps I knew that my dishonor was so complete that I couldn't get any worse, but either way I stepped out of line and called out to you. Wait, if your co-delegate had our terms for surrender, what was in your folder? Another look crossed his face, one that I would learn to be a wry smile. This folder here, you asked. This folder holds the terms of surrender. I told you that I didn't understand, and your smile faltered. You looked me right in the eyes and said, these are the terms we were going to offer for our surrender to you. When your fleet arrived in orbit, I finally understood. The ships were in bad shape. They were falling apart and looked like the first fleet that had attacked us. They were hospital ships and cargo haulers, refitted transports that looked as if they were about to fall apart. The massive ship we saw was actually your first colony ship, back before you had even discovered the phase drive and faster-than-light travel. You had grafted phase drives to it and had to tow it into position using decrepit ore haulers. Our occupiers were disheveled civilians that looked half-starved. Over the next many rotations, I learned the truth. You had gambled everything on this plan. Every last resource had been poured into the building of the grand fleets that you had used to attack us. Fields that you used to grow food were tilled over so you could build weapons factories. You had stripped 6 colonies and hundreds of asteroids and moons in order to assemble the vast fleets for your attack. You literally had nothing left to fight us. The fleet in orbit was there either to occupy us in the event of victory or to be used as an offering of slaves in the event of your defeat. You were so stretched thin of resources we had to supply you with fuel just so the bulk of your fleet could return home. You knew that attacking us directly might not have been a sure victory, so you had to make us believe that we couldn't face the endless onslaught of your fleets. Your final gamble had paid off. With peace secured, we were both able to rebuild your broken empire. Now we are the strongest of allies. We fight side by side against those that would dare stand to oppose us. I was only able to visit you now due to the fact that my fleet is running a joint training exercise with one of yours. That is why I am here now, and there is something I must ask you. I didn't realize at the time because there was so much to do. and I haven't been able to see you in the 4 cycles since the peace treaty was ratified. But now that I have you here, I must know. The last fleet we encountered during the final battle was 11, 12. You must tell me, as I have never been able to figure it out. What was the 12th fleet? What was 12 of 12? With that, the frail old man in the hospital bed looked over to the Kress fleet commander standing before him. A wry smile stretched across his weathered and pale face. "Perhaps," he whispered, "that is best left to the imagination."